You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. In this episode, we're going to be speaking about AI risk prediction and decision support systems in trauma care with Zane Perkins. So what to do really is look at the rapidly evolving role of AI in trauma care, specifically focused on AI risk prediction and decision support systems, also known as AI-TRiPS. So it's an artificial intelligence tool designed to really enhance decision-making in high-pressure trauma settings. So AI-TRiPS has its roots in research in Bayesian networks for clinical decision support, evolving into a system that bridges the gap between AI development and real-world application. But how do we ensure that AI tools are not just accurate, but also usable and indeed trusted by clinicians on the front line? So in military and civilian trauma care, rapid informed decisions can mean the difference between mortality and morbidity. So we're going to explore in this episode with Zane just how AI-TRiPS has been trialled in London's major trauma centres and indeed within London's air ambulance. Also its impact on clinical performance and whether it truly reduces cognitive load in pre-hospital care and in the resuscitation bay. So beyond trauma, AI-driven decision support could transform care not only for trauma, but analogues such as stroke, sepsis, and indeed cardiac arrest. So fundamentally, how does it allow us to make better decisions in a more consistent way? So Zane has been on the podcast before. He's a trauma surgeon and indeed a FEM consultant with London's Air Ambulance. Welcome back to the podcast, Zane.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
I just wondered if we could start, Zane, just by looking at the origins of AI in trauma. Maybe if you could just unpack and explain the origins of AI-TRiPS and what it is and how it's evolved from the initial research on Bayesian networks.
Yeah, so it's a very new field now, AI, and how we can apply it to our clinical care. And actually, there's not much AI being used in clinical care yet. It's starting to happen, but it's all new and topical at the moment. But about, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, I did a PhD on how we can apply some of these techniques to trauma care. And I was supervised by Professor Nigel Ty, who I've been working with since on this kind of work. And Nigel is a defense professor of surgery and also a consultant trauma and vascular surgeon at the Royal London and a professor at Queen Mary. So we've had a fruitful collaboration over the past decade and a half. But it started. We were both interested in a very difficult decision that trauma surgeons often face, and that was whether to try and save or amputate a badly injured limb. And then you can imagine, there's no winners there. Both options are often bad for the patients, and you're trying to weigh up what's likely to be the least bad of the two options. And a very, very difficult decision for a doctor to make, because clearly patients just want their healthy limb back, but if it's severely injured, that's not going to happen. And we started working with computer scientists at Queen Mary who had specialized in something called Bayesian networks. And they actually, of all the AI techniques out there, or machine learning techniques, I should rather call them, they were the most suitable for the kind of question we wanted to ask, for a number of reasons. And we might go into them later in the podcast again. But primarily, Bayesian networks allow you to build algorithms not just from data, but also to get knowledge in it. So knowledge from published literature and knowledge from experts. And you can imagine in healthcare, there's a lot of knowledge around. There's a lot of research being done, and to have a form of machine learning that can tap into that as well as into pure data was really beneficial. And the other really big benefit with Bayesian networks is they didn't have to rely on all information being available. And I think that's a very important point in any kind of emergency situation if you're wanting to use these kind of tools, is you have to accept that in emergency, there's lots of uncertainty and often there'll be missing information. So many machine learning techniques can't deal with that. Okay, so you would have to wait until you had all the information available before you can use it. Whereas a Bayesian network, the way they made and designed, it doesn't really bother them at all. Um, and then we started exploring how to use these tools to their best ability, and really made some good groundwork on those aspects. Building algorithms that can predict amputation or limb salvage success. Um, we realized, though, that it wasn't just about the limb, but also about the overall state of the patient. So we also looked at some other more general conditions, such as whether there was a risk to their life or whether there's any forms of organ failure, particularly coagulopathy and bleeding problems. And those models we realized were like had more benefit beyond just people with injured limbs. So this project where we're at now came out of that aspect, is that we started exploring those other models, the more generally applicable models in far more detail, and then trying to find where they best fitted into our like trauma workflows.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, like you said, it's a really interesting interface where, like you say, Bayesian networks meets AI. Therefore, you can start to, like you said, get some sort of, I guess in a way, some consistency amongst the data with consistent outcomes as well as consistent advice. But could I get you to speak to maybe bridging the gap, Zane, just the disconnect between AI algorithms and their adoption? Because the one thing is, like you said, accuracy, and another thing is really fundamentally trust in the algorithm, trust in the software that it will be sensitive enough to guide decision making, irrespective of the spectrum of presentations. Could I get you to sort of speak to bridging that gap?
Yeah, that's a really big issue in this world of using AI and that in healthcare at the moment. Is this big gap between being able to develop models that are highly accurate and actually being able to use them clinically. Um, now, so when I started, there were no kind of guidelines on how to do any of this stuff. So it made my PhD really interesting, but the guidelines now that are available would have made it much simpler for me and taken a lot of headaches away. But they've grown with the times, and only recently, I think only last year, maybe the year before, the guideline on how to actually take algorithms, AI algorithms from the development kind of phase, we call it in silico, like the bench side building of them into the real world. Those kind of guidelines actually only came through, and it needed those guidelines to probably get the big publishing journals and that to be interested in this kind of research, because prior to that they just didn't see the value in that kind of research. Now, I suppose the way to explain it is historically, and that's not even going back longer, like 10 years ago, everyone was very, very interested in trying to make algorithms exceptionally accurate. Okay. Um, And the reasons for this was that you were having to use this quite messy data with lots of missing bits. So you wanted to try and get around those problems with a more powerful piece of maths. But it's not the algorithm per se. It was the problem actually lay with the quality of the data. The maths is very powerful. Um, and and so there's a lot of focus on the technical aspects of trying to build better and better models, but no focus at all on how these models interacted with the end users, which would be the clinicians. Now, if you look at an example, say, of drugs, they have a clear delivery pathway. So you've got your laboratory like phases of making a drug. at the like first phase, and then you've got your like phase 3 trials where you do the big randomized trials to see their impact. But there's a really important middle part called like phase 1 and phase 2 trials where you test how the drug interacts with the human when you put it inside them. So, they start, you do some animal stuff, but then you move on to humans and you just see whether, what kind of complications it's going to make. Try to figure out what the right dose is. Are the kind of complications at higher doses acceptable to patients or not? And you work your way up and you see how this drug actually interacts with the patient. And only once you've figured all of that stuff out can you possibly go on to a massive multi-million pound international trial to see if it actually works and is beneficial. Um, but that middle phase is what was being completely left out in AI research. And now it's much more clearly defined that you have to do the studies with how the algorithms interact with the human. And that comes down to those points you brought up. So, one, is it easy to use or does it get in the way of your job? Because that's going to be a big barrier to the use. Two, is a clinician going to trust this at all? They're not just going to accept something because it's there. As we wouldn't give a patient a drug unless we understood how it worked and what it was going to do. I think it's fair that clinicians are the same with AI tools. Um, so you've got to do all the research to figure that out. And then once you've figured that stuff out and you've got a tool that works well with the clinicians that they trust, that they understand how to use and are happy to use, then you can move on to seeing whether them using it can make patients better and have better outcomes.
Yeah, and that all makes sense actually in that order. Um, and I think something we chatted offline about, which at the end of the day, this tool is there to support, which is really situation awareness and clinical decision making. To your point, it's really there to ease cognitive load and assist clinical decision making. Could I get you to speak to, just before we really progress into maybe the system integration and transitions of care, could I get you to speak to sort of some analogs where this would be super useful, like the military? Because in the civil landscape, for sure, I could see there's utility within the HEM systems. But could I get you to speak to maybe translating that? Because clinical decision making and situation awareness are super important in such a dynamic environment such as the military. Could I get you to sort of speak, especially when there's lots of casualties coming in, and you really need to make some really quick fire decisions and maybe offload some of that cognitive burden? Could I get you to speak to analogs such as the military?
Yeah, so my initial work with Professor Tai was focused mostly on military because that's essentially severe limb injuries were the signature kind of wound of in Iraq and Afghanistan and caused a lot of difficulty with those decisions. Um, Now, if you go right back to like fundamentals, if we look at how we make decisions in clinical medicine, doesn't matter where you are, well, we tend to try and make our decisions, especially difficult decisions, as a group. A number of senior people put their heads together and try and make the most sensible and rational decision. In hospitals around the world, that's quite well recognized. It's called an MDT. So any kind of big decisions around cancer surgery or vascular surgery or any of these things would be made by an MDT. Now you can imagine, ideally, someone has a life-threatening injury or limb-threatening injury, and there's different options on how to treat it that you would ideally sit down and meet with a number of people and make a sound decision. But time is really your enemy in trauma, and you might not have the time to do that. And the other thing that we all know is after hours, or in the military or austere environments, you just don't have those extra people. So you often are on your own. So we are trying to create a system that can be your like buddy to, help you with the decisions. So you've got like an expert with you in a box, basically. And even if you do have two or three consultants or to make a decision, you could still use the system. It will help anchor everyone's assessments of risk in a similar way, so everyone's talking about the same things. But the other probably important element of that question is how situational awareness and decision making link to each other. And I think this is really important. We spend a lot of time researching how humans make decisions, not our research, but looking at there's a lot out there, psychologists and that have done incredible work understanding how people make decisions and how experts make decisions. And that's really important. And essentially, it comes down to five important steps. And this can be anything. I mean, this can be from, the example I give in my talk sometimes, just something simple like catching a ball. But it's the exact same steps would be, making a complex decision on salvaging someone's badly damaged limb. But what happens first is you gather information. And that's just using your senses, using your eyes and ears, or in a clinical setting, it would be like attaching monitors, sending off blood samples, doing scans. But essentially, you're just gathering piles of information, everything you can. And then the next step is trying to understand what that information means. So in the situation of catching a ball, that's what speed is it coming? What direction is it coming? What kind of ball? Is it a heavy ball? Is it a light ball? That kind of stuff. So you need to understand what the data means, not just have the pure data. And then you move on to the third step, which is about weighing up what your options are. So what can you do? What options are available to you? And weighing up what's the best option in this situation. So again, with the ball, is it coming straight for you? Are you going to try and move out the way, or are you going to try and catch it? Are you going to catch it with one hand? Are you going to catch it with two hands? And you're going to make the decision that you think's the right thing to do. And then you move on to the next step, which is carry out whatever you decided. So do the action. And then you see what happens. So you measure your outcome. So you see what happens. Back to the analogy of the ball. Maybe you caught it. Maybe you didn't. You dropped it. Whatever has happened, that all feeds back to all the four preceding steps to learn how to do that better the next time. Every single step. Didn't you get enough information? Did you misunderstand the information? Did you pick the wrong option? You're learning all that stuff. So you need those five steps. But what we realized is, what we picked up from the is you can divide that five-phase step into the first two steps. That's situational awareness, so gathering information and understanding it. And the second two steps of your judgment on what to do and doing it is decision making. So you can then really summarize it down into being two steps. You've got situational awareness, then decision making, and then see your outcome. And I think what was really struck us then is because we realized there's a lot of pushback against using tools like this and AI in healthcare, and people worried about AI taking over roles from clinicians and patients not wanting to be treated by a machine when they could be treated by a human. And you could understand all of these worries, but if you look at that breakdown, if you look at your situational awareness part, you're just gathering information anyway. That's done by clinicians and machines, and then understanding the information. Now, clinicians or a human brain has limits to how much information it can take on. So although with modern advances, we're making more and more sensors, gathering more and more information, more and more blood tests, there's only so much that a human can take in and comprehend. There's limits, but there aren't any limits with a machine. It can take in as much data as you give to it, and it'll give you an exact estimate of the probability of anything you want, in frequencies. It will give it to way more detail, decimal points than you could possibly even find useful. So machines are really good at understanding data, and humans are good, but they can't match a machine's ability to do it. But then you look at the decision-making part, and the only part in there that requires a brain is the judgment part, because the action is just doing things. So the judgment is what you cognitively have to do, and that is actually a really complex task because it needs you to understand what the information means, but also it needs you to understand the context of where you're working and the situation you're in. It needs you to take into consideration things like what the patient wants, what the family wants, what their religion is, what your hospital, resources are. There's so many different elements to making a judgment and what you think is the right decision in that case. Currently, you know, AI can't cope with that kind of broad general intelligence. Um, Humans are excellent at that kind of stuff. They do it naturally, their ability. So we realized a really important thing is we wanted to use AI where AI was the most powerful and could really benefit the clinicians. And we didn't want to take away from what clinicians were really good at. So we wanted to focus AI purely on helping clinicians understand all the data that was coming in, but not influence their judgment on what the best course of action was. Um, and if you look at kind of errors, medical errors, you find that almost all medical errors come about, if you do like a true root cause analysis, they come about because of an error in the situational awareness side of things. The clinician didn't understand the information that was available, and therefore they got led on to make a wrong decision. So, for example, in trauma, you didn't give a blood transfusion because you didn't realize the patient was bleeding. They weren't tachycardic, the blood pressure seemed normal, the you didn't think they were bleeding. And that's where the error lies. So if you can improve that situational awareness side, you will very much likely to improve the decisions that are made. And then there's all the downstream effects. If you make better decisions and less errors, then your clinical care will be better, then your patients' outcomes will be better. So it all flows from understanding the situation you're in initially.
So let's look at what happens currently, Zane, if that's okay. Just so if you could maybe just walk us through what happens currently in the transitions of care I guess in a way, in some of London's sickest patients, because that's a good analog for where the gap is and where we can improve.
Yeah, and then that's around this AI-TRiPS study that we're doing. This is the kind of this is the crux of the study, is trying to like really use this tool at a place we think it will really have value. So what normally happens in London, we got a nice, mature now and organized trauma system. And say, for example, the air ambulance, it gets dispatched to the most severely injured people in London. And then we'll take them to one of four major trauma centers, working together with the London Ambulance Service. And the trial is going to have all of those stakeholders involved. So all four MTCs, the London Ambulance Service and the London Air Ambulance, will all be all participants in this trial. So what normally happens is air ambulance will be sent out to someone who's sick. The team will assess the patient, examine them. They'll attach a monitor, so some information will already be being gathered digitally. But some information is going to be in the clinician's head because they've examined them, they're looking and seeing the injuries and feeling them. So that's a barrier, because to make that digital and be able to send it to the people who need it means that clinician now needs to find a computer, turn it on, take his gloves off, enter it all. And we didn't want to have that barrier in place. But what we normally do is we give a scene update to our dispatcher. So we tell them, briefly, but a good summary of what's wrong with the patient. And then the dispatcher now knows that information as well. So we've tapped into that because then we can use the dispatcher to actually turn that information digitally. And in the future, we might even just do it purely on voice recognition kind of AI software that can summarize the conversation over the radio. So that's what normally happens. You attach your monitor and you do a scene update, and then you treat the patient, and then you take them to hospital. And when you're about 10 minutes away from the hospital, you put in a call to the hospital just to give them an alert that the patient's coming in. And that's via telephone to one of the nurses in the emergency department. And you give some very brief information on the patient. And essentially, the hospital then will call down their trauma team, who will then start gathering in the resus bay. And then a few minutes later, this patient arrives. And really, the team in the hospital have very sparse information on it. So they might know that it's someone who's been stabbed or shot or hit by a car, but they don't really know much more than that. And then they start from scratch. So they all listen to a very short handover from the team, the air ambulance team, and then they start their own attaching monitors, taking blood, doing another examination. And it takes them about 10 minutes then to start understanding what's going on. So we thought we could improve that by sending all the information the pre-hospital team have into the hospital before the patient arrives. So we'll have a big dashboard in the resus bay, and it will summarize, the injuries and the physiology from the monitor, but also run these risk prediction algorithms because that's what we're trying to do with our brain with all this information, is understand, like, how sick is this person? How likely are they to die? Are they bleeding? Are they coagulopathic? Those kind of things. So we can take all the data we've got and run, these algorithms on them and make very accurate predictions of those things. And we can show that to clinicians as well. So the clinicians then can see this information before the patient even arrives. So that is situational awareness. They then are starting from a much higher point when the patient actually hits the resus bed, of knowing kind of what's wrong with the patient and how sick they are, and then take it from there. So that's it sounds subtle, but I think it's a really important that change from pre-hospital care to in-hospital care is a vulnerable part in the patient's journey, especially if they're very sick and every second counts for something. You can't have that like drop off in care and that pause before the second team, get up to speed with what's going on.
Yeah, listen, I agree actually, Zane, and as you were saying, there is a real lag phase, albeit 10 minutes or 5, 10 minutes, and to your point around the sickest patients in London, that actually sometimes they don't necessarily have the physiology, and the anatomy doesn't have 5 minutes. It needs to be synchronous, and you're right, just closing the gap on that information, but not just the information, the situational awareness around the urgency of the injury load and the critical nature of that transition, and the ongoing care, so they're not playing catch up, as you were saying. And also something really interesting about this and about the screen is having a single point of truth in a resuscitation bay, whereby, because that snapshot in time handover that occurs from the HEMS doctor or HEMS team, if you miss that, that's a single point in time. But actually having some enduring information and enduring informatics is a single point of truth over time. So even if you miss the handover, maybe in the future there might not even be a handover, or it might you can augment what's being seen on the screen, and but it just means there's an enduring sense of a single point of truth. So you've got this sense of situation awareness, irrespective of whether you receive the handover or not. And I think that's a powerful tool as well. Could I get you to speak to, so you spoke earlier about how we make decisions and how this is going to support decision making, and on previous podcasts we've had clinicians come to speak really about treatment scripts and pathology scripts that you see maybe a stabbing, or you see someone with meningitis, and you start to visualize a whole library in your brain about what someone with meningitis looks like, or what a stabbing looks like, I guess. And the problem is within post-op care is the 10th case doesn't necessarily look like the last 9 cases, because there's, and you can attest to this, there's outliers within both the literature and anecdotal practice that actually catch clinicians off. But what we're reliant on is that 10th case looking like all 9 cases. Like you said, the bleeding patient that just doesn't look like they're bleeding and actually hasn't got the physiological reserve, but we haven't known that, haven't seen that, haven't experienced that. But actually, and that catches us out, and there's avoidable death there. Could I get you to speak to decision making, human decision making, and how maybe we leverage AI to, yeah, I guess in a way, decrease our confirmation bias?
Yeah, so that's the idea, is it would decrease a lot of different kinds of biases that can happen in that, like I say, it's a very vulnerable period with a lot of happening, a lot of information changing, and lots of uncertainty, and time pressures and everything. So there's so many reasons why um, clinicians can make errors and mistakes in their thinking. Um, and and why we've also gone down the lines of using the AI purely to summarize essentially objective data and not taking it a step further in trying to suggest what to do with that. So because it will be very objective what it says. You might have a completely abnormal presentation of bleeding, but the algorithm will still tell you how likely this person is to be bleeding. So it's still going to give you the information and might make the clinician have a rethink and be like, well, you know, I think it might be, something else, but this machine is telling me, well, it's still quite a high chance that it's bleeding. I should at least make sure we don't discount that. We can certainly, uh, look at other possible differentials, but you're not going to, only focus on the one that you're thinking of. It will highlight other things that might still be likely, or that, there's a high chance of death, or that the patient could get coagulopathic. So, I think it is a safety net. I think, and we've definitely made it as something that clinicians are absolutely allowed to overrule or adjust up or adjust down with their clinical expertise. I mean, it's not, the algorithm can only work with the data that's fed into it, and it's not getting as much as the human will be getting. Certainly, as we want it to be used like pre-arrival to at the point of arrival, and then after that you start getting so much information in, and we're not going to keep feeding information in. Then you would just use the information you're getting from the scans and that. But yeah, so I think that's what we see the use as. And the other real plus is these teams are quite big when you got very sick people. It's not unusual at the Royal London to have 20 or more people come down for a trauma resuscitation. And I think when you got big teams all coming at different times, you know, some of them will have been told what's coming in, some weren't. There's a little bit of Chinese whispers going on, kind of thing. Some might have heard the handover clearly, some people might not have heard it or might have misheard some parts. And you land up, as you say, with maybe in the group, lots of different internal views or situational awarenesses of what's going on, from someone thinking this is a sick patient to someone thinking that there's nothing going on here. Whereas having all this information in one focal point might help get rid of some of that variability. So everyone, before the patient arrives is kind of on the same page. Um, and it'll anchor all of them in the same kind of place, and then the whole team can adjust up or adjust down as new information comes up. But at least you're starting from a fairly similar place that's objectively based on reality.
Yeah, no, indeed, absolutely, absolutely. Can I just let's just pivot slightly and look at operational and clinical impact, and just if we could get you to speak to maybe some of the key challenges in integrating AI and indeed this software platform into both the major trauma centers and LAA and the ambulance service, because like you said, it's a mature system. There's definitely gaps, and this serves to maybe close one of those gaps. But what are some of the key challenges, Zane, that you've been bumping up against that really have to be overcome?
Yeah, so I suppose the biggest challenge to us or anyone, and no one's done this kind of research, really. This is one of the first trials of AI to support decision making in the world. And definitely, it's not the first in trauma. Uh, there's a French trial also happening at the same time with a group of scientists and clinicians that we've been now collaborating with for a while. So it's really nice that both of us are kind of moving through this phase together. But these are the first two trials in trauma of kind of using this kind of technology to support decision making. But overall, in all of medicine, there's very few looking at AI's role in decisions of clinicians. There's a lot of work having happened in AI's role in helping to interpret pictures, whether that be, videos of like colonoscopies, trying to find polyps or scans, CT scans, and that being able to identify different pathologies or X-rays. That's a very good use of AI and one that's, dare to say, probably easier to apply, because you've got the data set, the picture of whatever it is, and you've got the maths, so you can, train it and teach it, and then it makes a useful tool. Um, but using it in decision making is actually quite difficult, because decision making and situational is a bit of a construct. This is human behavior, so it's a lot more complex than a CT scan and seeing how it interacts. So yeah, so we're working on that problem, and now no one's going to be able to use these tools clinically um, until the research is done, like the trials are done to show its benefits patients. Okay, so that's probably the biggest barrier. So that's why we're doing this trial, and that's why our French compatriots are doing that trial. To do the research, though, is incredibly difficult. Firstly, because no one's done it, so there's no like pathway to follow. And then at every kind of regulatory level, there's no precedent, so it's always scrutinized maximally, and naturally there's a caution in medicine, so you get a lot of pushback. So we've have had hurdle after hurdle after hurdle to try and make sure this study happens. From the regulators, I mean, these kind of tools have to be regulated by, in England it's the MHRA, or in the UK, in America it would be the FDA. They're regulated as software as a medical device, quite rightly. But underneath that, even the regulators aren't sure how, because there's a big range of what these things can do. From, like I say, what we're trying to do is make sure our software as a medical device doesn't so all the normal processes are in place. So this is purely an adjunct. It's not replacing anything. And we've made sure that it doesn't tell clinicians what to do, doesn't even suggest what to do. So it doesn't interfere in any way with the clinician's decisions. Then the clinician's still responsible for the decisions. It's just helping them understand the data. So it's only one piece of information in amongst many pieces of information that clinicians will be able to use to make their decisions. And we've purposefully done a lot of that to allow it to be categorized lower on the risk matrix that these regulators would be using. Because clearly trauma is not a benign condition. So the patients clearly could die with or without the intervention. They're at risk of die. So that's a regulatory problem. Another is research ethics. As you can imagine, patients are worried about lots of things with this. replacing of clinicians, the biases that might be inbuilt in it, the data security around it, and so the ethics boards are also very, uh, you know, they want very clearly defined how you're going to get around all those issues. But what's been really nice is, we've been working with patient groups and the ethics boards and the regulators, and overall, it's actually going quite well when people understand what you're trying to do and then they see what you're trying to do, then it demystifies a lot of the stuff and then it seems, completely sensible.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And as you were saying before about it not necessarily being software as a medical device, because like you said, the EU MDR, the European Union medical device requirements can be very stringent, but like you said, it's translation of data hopefully can be the bottom rung of that rather than the most strict EU MDR requirements. Just looking at, so let's just boil it down, Zane, before we really look at finally some of the maybe the future of AI. But just boiling it down into really, in a way, it really mandates or supports the critical decisions at the moment. Am I right in thinking three main domains? So should you give blood transfusions? Should you, what's the risk of death or the risk of dying? And indeed, sort of continuity of care, sort of on longevity of survivability. Could I get you to nail down sort of the three prerequisites that it will suggest initially, and that's not to say it's the full spectrum in the fruition of time, but could I get you to nail down sort of the three domains of information that it will translate to support clinical decision making?
Yeah, well, so in trauma, your three main outcomes, say, is whether you're going to live or die, whether you're going to have any degree of organ failure or not, and probably the most important organ failure in trauma is coagulopathy because of how much it impacts bleeding. Um, so we we've purposely those are the risks that we're going to provide with the algorithms to the patients. There will be the risk of dying, the risk of coagulopathy, and then we've also are going to give the risk of acute kidney injury, just mainly because that's a quite easily and objectively measured organ failure that's quite common. The kidneys are, quite susceptible to hyperperfusion in trauma. And there's good markers to measure that. So that could be, you could use it just as a marker of the risk of acute kidney injury, but yet also as an overall marker of a patient having multiple organ failure. Um, so those are the pure actual true risks, and that's what us as senior clinicians are trying to, whether we're conscious of it or not, that's what we're trying to figure out when we're examining patients and looking at their physiology on the monitor. The other thing we're going to give them is not a true risk, but I think it's still something we're all trying to do, and that is an estimate of how much blood this patient might need. So in essence, that's a marker of whether you think they're bleeding or not, because if it says none, then clearly they're not bleeding. But we've done this in a unique way that's not actually in any of the literature or any of the algorithms that have been built before. So we're going to break it down into time categories. So how much blood you might need in the first 2 hours, and then the next 4 hours after that, and then the next 4 hours after, and break the whole first 24 hours down into clinically relevant time categories. And in each of those, we would give a breakdown of the average amount of blood that someone with the data that's gone in would require with some kind of confidence limits on it. Because I think that's what we want as clinicians. We don't want to know how much blood they might need on the first day or in their hospital stay. We want to know like how much you're going to need in the next few hours because we there's logistical delays to getting that. and it allows for planning and being, like I say again, being ahead of the curve rather than playing catch up. So that's the information we will be giving in the dashboard, and we won't really be overstepping that much. We'll also just be giving the raw information in a nicely, how you'd expect to see it. Like this is however old they are, male or female, what the mechanism of injury was, what the main injuries were that were found, what the main treatments that were given were. And that we're doing because I think as clinicians we would demand that. We wouldn't use a pure standalone prediction algorithm without knowing what it's based on. And this is about trust. So these are the kind of modifications, well, not modifications, but how we built it to engender trust as well, is you can see the data. It'll be presented to you in most of the dashboard, and you can see the risks that the algorithms are running on that data and coming up with. And I think that helps clinicians, believe it. But in the trial, we'll be measuring, so as our primary endpoint, we'll be measuring clinicians' behavior in their situational awareness or their ability to perceive risk. So it's a step wedge randomized trial. And I'm sure many people listening probably won't know what that is, but essentially it's a before and an after study that the time you change from before to after changes randomly in each hospital, moving in a stepped way, a step fashion across the hospital. So in each hospital is going to have the same clinicians. The whole trial will only run for a year. So it'll be the same people there mostly for the year. So they will work with just as normal as they are today for however long, and then they'll transition to using this dashboard. And then what we can do is we can then compare how good they were at estimating risks before when they were unassisted compared to themselves again when they were assisted. So we can't randomly just do it anywhere around, because if we give them the machine first, then they might have learned a lot from the machine, and then that will contaminate the portion where they don't. So that always has to be the same way around. So we will simply ask clinicians after every case, how likely do you think this person is to die? Do you think they have coagulopathy? What's their chances of needing blood in the next few hours? And they'll get asked those same questions all the way through, and then we can see whether using the dashboard makes them more accurate at making those estimates. But then we'll also be measuring the downstream effects. Now it's powered to see whether we can make clinicians better at estimating risk and essentially then better at understanding the situation they're in. But we want to see also whether that results in better clinical decisions, so better activation of major hemorrhage protocols, better, use of definitive hemorrhage control, getting them to hemorrhage control quicker, and then onwards further downstream, do the patients actually do better? Do they, survive? More of them survive. So we'll be looking at all the onward effects, but you can, it's important. This is a struggle. You're talking about barriers earlier, is because drugs, all of that stuff is implicit in how they work. The only thing anyone's interested in is if you put the drug into a human, do they get better or not? Because that's all you want to know. But the drug has a direct effect on whether the patient gets better or not, by its action. An algorithm has no direct effect on the human body. It can't make you, it's just a bunch of numbers, it can't make you better or worse or live or die. It, however, can impact the clinician, and then the clinician can make better decisions, and that's the effect of how it makes a patient better. So we've had to argue really hard that we need to measure as our primary outcome what the actual intervention can directly affect, not the downstream indirect effects. Even though we clearly that's important, we want to know that patients do better, not worse.
Yeah, no, indeed, and that's quite difficult to prove. But like you said, it's going to be really interesting over the period of the trial, over the major trauma centers, and getting that data, just to, like you say, just to understand adoption, understands um, habituation as well. Like in that you said, and taking those snapshots of the routinized habitual practice prior to the intervention and then after the intervention will be really, really interesting. Just as we're coming to land on the interview, Zane, just a couple more questions. One would really be around analogs of comparison, really, because this is fascinating and really essential for trauma. Yeah, because as you can attest, it's the kinesthetic is visceral when there's a million pieces of information. Just even landing in a helicopter is sometimes overwhelming. So just trying to understand everything on the back of that it's absolutely necessary. But could we look at other comparators which should really maybe be served well by this technology, such as heart attacks or indeed strokes or cardiac arrest? Could you speak to some maybe the downstream pathologies which might really benefit from this kind of intervention?
Yeah, so I think, cardiology has always been ahead with this kind of telemedicine stuff. They don't call it AI, but the ability of modern 12 lead ECGs to make a summary of what's going on and how accurate that is, and the ease to of which you can pass it on to the next team is really a model for all of this kind of work. Um, you know, I'm not a cardiologist, so but luckily they can get a lot of rich information from like 12 lead ECG and that kind of stuff. Other emergencies, there isn't yet, and maybe it's still to be found, but there's not yet some kind of way you can just gather information that's so rich in what the problem is. So you rely on clinical examination and your vital signs and all these different, trends of response over time. Um, so I think all the other emergencies kind of fit into that picture. A stroke as well, because you can't get the CT scan really pre-hospital. So, that's obviously super detailed information when you get it, but initially that's not there. So I think for me, they're like primarily like benefit of this exercise with this trial is just seeing whether we can actually share information digitally between pre-hospital and in-hospital in a real time in a real world setting. Like if you can actually move that information in real time and then apply algorithms to those data streams in real time so that the information is it's slightly cliched, but you want the information in the right place at the right time in front of the right people, all of those kind of things. So can you achieve that? Like the trauma side of it is just an example case study, but if we can show that you can move information digitally in real time and get it to the people who need to know it at the right time when they're ready for it in the right format, then that's a massive breakthrough because no one's really shown that in like real world operational settings.
Yeah, no, indeed, indeed. And it'd be fascinating to see how this plays out. Just finally, Zane, actually, from in that regard, really, where do you see this going within the next 5 years? Because I could ultimately see us being sat around a clinical governance meeting where the algorithm or indeed the software could be part of the cold debrief of the clinical governance meeting, whereby you bring, was the compliance and was there not compliance to the algorithm, because is you can apply clinical judgment and reasoning to as to why you deviated from the but can you see it starting to be embedded potentially within clinical medicine adoption kind of and starting to really filter through to the governance of cases?
It could do. I mean, algorithms probably the first. I mean, they have been used for a long time for governance because governance doesn't have those time limits, doesn't have those problems with uncertainty or missing data. So even in trauma, there's injury severity score, TRiPS scoring, all of those things are all really governance tools so that you can match your patients and work out, how you're doing and benchmark yourself. What was always missing was because a lot of them were built initially with the aim of trying to help front-end clinicians with decision making. And they made really these tools, but they always land up only being able to be used for governance because there's just too many barriers to being able to use it at the front line. So it could land up there, but we've really, really put a lot of effort in trying to make something that's fit for purpose for, working in the emergency setting. So I hope it will stay there and be a tool for emergency work. I mean, clearly people would need to, when you're going through something, look at if it becomes part of standard care, you would have to always keep an eye on what this showed and how clinicians used it. And you might find times when it doesn't work as intended or causes a problem, and those will need to be flagged up and realized when it works well and when there's these cases where it might not work as well. So that's our goal, though, is to make a really useful tool for clinicians. I mean, I suppose we've just moved across in the last few years from paper pre-hospital notes to like an electronic patient record. And even those, those kind of EPCRs that we use, they were always touted as going to solve this problem. Like you could put in all your information whilst you're on scene and on your way in, and the clinicians in the hospital could log in and read it all before you arrived, and everything would be, moved in no time at all between the. And in practice, that doesn't happen. Like the clinicians come and they drop off the patient and then they go sit outside and then they do their notes post-care. So there's nothing available to the hospital team. And the sicker patients are, the more that is, because you have even less time to get out the the iPad and fill anything in. So this is a real attempt to try and plug that hole, because that's what clinicians want, is the in-hospital clinicians, and I think pre-hospital clinicians, they want to be able to pass on the information they've got in a reliable way that can improve the patient's journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to your point there, Zane, and just finishing off, you're right. The real time leverage of this tool is where it's at. There's real time benefit because, like you say, calculating a TRiPS score or a major trauma score, or indeed a any type of scoring, really requires complex maths and actually doesn't necessarily help in the moment. So actually, even true to say, even calculating the GCS is highly subjective and doesn't necessarily help guide treatment. So you're right. The real leverage is in the moment, helping support and guide treatment based on the information, making sense of the information for the clinician. Listen, Zane, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for the last hour. It's really great just to touch base with you. We'll signpost in the show notes anything we can on AI-TRiPS so that people can go away and read in slow time and just get up to speed with some of this fantastic work and trials that you're doing. And we'll revisit it down the line because I'd love to understand the results that you find in time. But listen, thank you for your time today.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me on.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.